It was supposed to be their dream home. A sprawling Victorian mansion on a hilltop, surrounded by acres of forest. When John and Sarah bought the property, they had visions of restoring it to its former glory. But from the moment they moved in, things started to go wrong. At first, it was just small things. The sound of footsteps in the hallway at night, doors opening and closing on their own. Sarah would hear voices whispering in her ear when she was alone in the house. But they shrugged it off as their imagination, and continued with their renovations. As the weeks went by, the occurrences became more frequent and more unsettling. They would wake up to find all the doors in the house open, despite having locked them before bed. They found strange symbols drawn on the walls and what looked like blood. And then, they started seeing things. The first time it happened, John was sitting in the living room, reading a book. He looked up and saw a figure standing in the doorway, watching him. But when he blinked, it was gone. He told himself that it was just his imagination, but the feeling of being watched never went away. Sarah started having nightmares. In them, she was being chased through the halls of the mansion by a dark figure with glowing eyes. She would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that she had seen the figure in the corner of the room. But when she turned on the light, it was never there. They tried to ignore it, but the tension between them grew. They started arguing more, snapping at each other over small things. John was convinced that they were being haunted, but Sarah refused to believe it. She thought that John was just being paranoid. But then, things took a turn for the worse. One night, they were woken up by the sound of glass breaking. They rushed downstairs to find that all the windows in the house had shattered, as if they had been hit by a strong gust of wind. But there was no storm outside. That's when they realized that they needed help. They called in a team of paranormal investigators, who spent the night in the house with them. They set up cameras and recording devices, hoping to catch evidence of the haunting. The night was long and tense. The investigators picked up strange noises on their equipment, and at one point, they saw a shadowy figure moving through the house. But when they reviewed the footage the next day, they found nothing conclusive. Despite the lack of evidence, John and Sarah knew that they couldn't stay in the house any longer. They packed up their belongings and left, never to return. The house sat empty once again, its dark secrets hidden behind its walls. Years later, a new family moved into Hilltop Manor. They didn't know about its past, or the horrors that had taken place within its walls. But they would soon find out. The new family consisted of a couple, their 2 children, and their elderly grandmother. They had fallen in love with the charm and character of the old Victorian mansion, and were excited to make it their new home. But they would soon regret their decision. At first, the strange occurrences were subtle. They would hear footsteps in the hallway at night, and doors would open and close on their own. But then things began to escalate. One night, the grandmother woke up to find a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. Its eyes glowed red, and it seemed to be staring right at her. She screamed, and the rest of the family rushed into the room. But when they turned on the lights, the figure was gone. The children began having nightmares, just like Sarah had years before. They would wake up screaming, convinced that something was in their room with them. The parents tried to comfort them, but they were starting to feel like they had made a terrible mistake by moving into the house. One day, the mother was in the kitchen, making lunch, when she heard a voice whisper in her ear. It was a man's voice, and it was speaking in a language she didn't understand. She turned around, but there was no one there. The family decided to call in a team of paranormal investigators, just like John and Sarah had done years before. They spent the night in the house, setting up cameras and recording devices. But this time, the evidence was overwhelming. The cameras picked up strange shadows moving through the house, and the recording devices picked up voices speaking in languages that no one understood. At one point, they heard a blood-curdling scream that seemed to come from the basement. When they investigated, they found nothing. The investigators concluded that the house was indeed haunted, and that there was something malevolent in residence. They advised the family to leave the house as soon as possible, before it was too late. The family took their advice and moved out of the house, never looking back. But they would never forget the terror that they had experienced within its walls. Hilltop Manor remained empty once again, its dark secrets hidden behind its decaying walls. No one dared to buy the property after the stories of its haunting had spread throughout the town. The once beautiful mansion became a relic of the past, a place where only the bravest would dare to set foot. And even then, they would never forget the feeling of being watched, the whispers in their ear, and the shadowy figures that seemed to follow them wherever they went.